Thank you, Victoria. Thank you to the World Green Building Council. Someone just reminded me this is the last one of these implementation labs that I'm going to have the privilege of addressing in my current role. So I'm glad it's with you guys. Look, the whole idea of the 2030 breakthroughs was born of the collaborative work of the Marrakesh Partnership in trying to get really practical and say, okay, if we've got to get to net zero by 2050, as the science tells us, then we've got to know what we have to do in each sector: steel, cement, electric vehicles. And in many sectors, of course, it's kind of a one technology play, right? We take combustion engines to batteries, we take kerosene to sustainable aviation fuel. But in the built environment, it's much more complicated. So I think it's really impressive that the community around the built environment have come together to, and as part of the Marrakesh Partnership, and agree this very clear 2030 goal that all new projects are net zero in operation with greater than 40% reduction in embodied carbon. And of course, that's also going to rely on the breakthroughs on energy, on steel, on cement. And I was just saying how great it is to see the video just laying out all those signals of change. Right? This is not an abstract conversation, so I'm thrilled to see you all here today to explore and share and build our collective confidence that actually we know what to do and someone's doing it somewhere, and we have to learn from each other to scale everything up. One of the things we often are told is that this transition is going to cost us a lot of money, and of course that's true. What people often forget when they say this transition is going to cost us a lot of money is that not doing this transition is going to cost us a lot more money. Like, the counterfactual is not just that we carry on as we are. The counterfactual gets worse and worse and worse. So this is also a huge opportunity for, of course, businesses and investors, but also cities, regions, and countries to use this nexus issue of the built environment, which after all is where we all live, work, learn, love, play, as one of those nexus issues which helps us turn the crisis of runaway climate change to the only story of economic development of the 21st century, as Nick Stern tells us. And I'm told that green buildings represent a $24.7 trillion opportunity. That sounds like a pretty big development opportunity. And I'm also really keen and delighted to have seen that what sometimes can be presented as largely a technological transition is, with this community, I know, very much seen as a human one as well. And it was great with Christina and our dear friend Sheila Patel to be launching a Roof Over Our Heads initiative. So I'm keen that we sometimes, like in my country, in the UK, when we talk about green buildings, people think about office buildings and new 4-bedroom family homes, right? That's a developed country problem, and we have a developing country opportunity to use this transition to really provide high quality, dignified housing for the millions of people who live in slums. And I'll just close by saying that I'm particularly pleased that your work as a community working with the non-state actors has infected the state actors. And this idea of breakthroughs, which comes from the Marrakesh Partnership Pathways, has now been picked up by the UK presidency last year in this state breakthrough agenda. And that we just this morning had the governments of Morocco and France announcing that they're going to lead the built environment breakthrough as part of that bigger collaboration. So that ambition loop that we often talk about, I think, can be turbocharged now. There's 13 countries already in that. I think with the cities and regions and businesses and grassroots organisations in the Marrakesh Partnership, there's an opportunity to encourage many, many more countries and to show them the great work you're doing and embolden them to increase faster acts on the built environment in their NDCs as we go into the Stocktake year next year. So I'll end there and thank you all for joining. I'm going to stay for about half an hour, look forward to learning a lot, and then I'll hand back to Victoria. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you so much, Nigel, and thank you for your support in championing this agenda and the role of the sector. We do indeed have an enormous challenge but the scale and complexity of the challenges is matched by the scale of those who are willing to make a difference and take this front runner and leadership action. So really delighted to have so many of you here today and hopefully joining us online. So we are here to discuss the 2030 breakthrough. As we know, we need to achieve total decarbonisation across all sectors of the economy by 2050. But as Nigel's mentioned, many of the solutions for decarbonising our built environment already exist. Some of those are quite low tech, some of those are already being deployed, but we need to take those solutions and drive them at scale. And so the 2030 breakthrough sets out that all new projects completed from 2030 are net zero carbon in operation with a 40% reduction at least in embodied carbon, and that should help us go a large way, a big way towards making a significant dent in the enormous, nearly 40% of carbon emissions that our global building and construction sector are responsible for, and around 50% of extracted materials and huge amounts of waste that come from our practices to build and operate our building. And it's estimated that between 2020 and 2050, new projects will generate half of their emissions from embodied sources such as concrete and steel, and using half from energy during their operation. So it's so crucial that we address embodied carbon, and we're addressing it at the point where there's most opportunity to influence reductions, and that's right at the beginning of projects. And I often say that in building terms, 2030 is just around the corner. We know that these projects that are going to be built in 2030 are already being designed. They're already in the design process. That's how long it takes to bring projects in our industry to life. And yet we also have this enormous legacy of existing buildings that simply aren't fit for purpose, are not performing well, are not providing us with healthy ways to live our lives, in fact often detrimental to our productivity and our health and well-being. So yes, we have an enormous challenge, but really thrilled that we have so many people here that can help us unlock the solutions that will help us in this challenge. We know that 2/3 of people will live in cities by 2060, and that half of the urban fabric to accommodate those are not yet built. So we just simply need to be acting today. And we need to be pulling various levers across that very complex system and that very complex and fragmented value chain. And it's brilliant to see so many events here at the COP27 conference this year. There's the Building to COP27 coalition that has brought together so many events, and we think there's around 200 events on the built environment alone across this year's COP27, across the blue zone, the green zone, innovation zone, and some online too. So we're really trying to embed the fact that the sector is here as a solution, a critical solution to a resilient and zero emissions future. And so many of those sessions have been about implementation. They've been about sharing the solutions that already exist, the examples of front-runner leadership from businesses, from cities, in enacting some of the levers that we're going to discuss here today. So the way this session's going to work is that we have someone who's representing one of those 7 levers that we've been watching through the video that's been playing as we've come in. We have the supply side. We have demand related to the private sector, demand related to the public sector, policy and regulation, finance, and finally civil society. And the reason that these levers of change have been identified is that, to Nigel's point about the non-state actors and the role of non-state actors, you have many ambition loops that function where the non-state actors need to be demonstrating the level of leadership and ambition necessary to create confidence from other sectors like the policymakers at subnational and national level. In turn, that creates more systems and more confidence in more action from the private sector, and equally creating more confidence in mainstream regulation. And we also know that there are many ambition loops happening within those sectors as well. So within the business sector, there are ambition loops where we have companies partnering with other front-runner companies to identify what those solutions are and bring them to scale, prove the possible. So we're going to hear from each of our speakers representing each of these levers of change. So first of all, representing the supply chain, I'd like to welcome Sustainability and Climate Leadership Director at JLL, Nidhi as well. Welcome, Nidhi. For the demand public sector, I'd like to welcome Director of Sustainability and Physics at Buro Happold, Smith Mordak. Welcome, Smith. For demand in the private sector, we have the Head of Buildings and Sustainability at Dar Group. Welcome, Balsam. Welcome today. Hi there. And for policy, we have the Managing Director of Regions and Mayoral Engagement and Regional Director for Africa at C40 Hastings Chikoko. For finance, we have the Policy and External Affairs Director at Real. Hi there, Lucy Livesley. Welcome. And representing civil society, we have the Global Program Manager for Built Environment at IHRB, Alejandro Rivera. Welcome, Alejandro, all the way down there. Hi there. Great. So, how this is going to work is that we're going to ask each of our sector representatives to share with you their views and examples of signals of change we're already seeing on behalf of that signal, on behalf of that lever, from their work within industry. Some examples of case studies that highlight the actions that we all need to be taking to achieve the 2030 breakthrough. And we'd like you as the audience to think about which lever type, for example, demand signal or policy implementation, would have the biggest impact on moving the sector globally towards our 2030 breakthrough outcome that we were showing on screen earlier. There are QR codes around the seats, and there's going to be one that pops up on screen after we've heard the pitches from all of the various sector representatives, and we would like you to vote on which lever you feel would have the biggest impact on moving the sector towards those goals. And then once we've heard those interventions, once we've opened the vote to the audience, we'll then check out the results and then have some further conversation about what those results are telling us. So with that, we're going to turn into our turning pledges into action part of this session. I'd like to invite Nidhi to start.
Hi everyone. My name is Nidhi Baiswar and I work as Sustainability and Climate Leadership Director at JLL, and I'm going to talk about supply. Supply, the law says, supply normally follows demand. But if you look into the built environment sector, supply can create demand. And how? I'll go through some of the points that I have to share. There are some key actors who play a very vital role in shifting this mindset in the industry around the built environment and for us to get to that breakthrough. The first set of key actors are the experts, the architects, developers, and as Victoria pointed out, they are the ones who are designing these buildings. They are the ones who are engaging with the clients and pushing the agenda around getting to zero carbon and the breakthrough lever that we are talking about. Now, within the supply lever, the action that we've highlighted under the breakthrough is energy efficiency measures to reduce operational energy intensity of new buildings by at least 30% by 2025. What this means is that we have to design buildings, homes, offices, schools, hospitals, that use less energy. And if we are to use existing buildings, we have to retrofit them so that they consume less energy. Now, what this means is our designers have to work really hard to try and embed these design features to make a sustainable building, a building that uses zero or low energy towards the end of the day, and we have to meet our targets there. Those are the first set of factors. The second set of factors are, in my opinion, the key players. They are the users of the buildings, the tenants, the occupiers. They are the ones who will be using that building after it's built, and it's very important to get them to understand how their building was designed and how they can use the building systems to get to that energy efficiency mode that we had designed the building for. So behavior change is a big challenge in our industry. People have been using buildings the way they did since so many years, and now if we're telling them that we have to meet our 2025 target, they have to live in a certain way, it'll be difficult for them to adapt to that change. This change management program that we have to drive through our building users is something that we have to push forward. The third set of key actors are our investors or public bodies or big corporates that have a huge portfolio of assets that are existing buildings. So, for example, your public bodies or councils who've got offices, council homes, and corporates that own offices and other estate that they have. Now, these assets that they hold in their portfolio are very old, or most of them are old, and they are very low performing when it comes to energy efficiency. We have to push the agenda through them to get them to come up with a transition plan for their buildings, how their buildings are going to achieve the energy use intensity that we are targeting by 2025 or 2050. So that's another level that we have to get engaged with. And these are the actors that will drive as well the finance side of things. Now, to encompass it all up, we've got the fourth set of players, which are cities and states. And in the recent past, as you saw on the slides here, where there are lots of different actions that have been taken by cities and countries. There's a good piece of research that JLL did last year around decarbonizing cities and real estate, where we studied about 32 cities and the actions these cities have taken to get to net zero. And we've studied what their targets look like. Now, to put things into context, when cities are designing their policies around getting to net zero, there are basically two sets of areas that they focus on, the carrots and the sticks. So if we were to talk about the sticks, these are the regulations, the building codes that we talk about, and the carbon tax, the market-related instruments like the carbon tax, carbon pricing, and so on that cities and councils would execute on a city level. Then there are the carrot side of things, where there are incentives, where there are the funds that are subsidies that are issued for the built environment. And then we've got the accelerator programs that some city already have in place. To give you a few examples I can give you a great example of the stick approach. The New York City has launched or has come up with Local Law 97, which is about to be in action in 2024, which has set energy use intensities of different building types, and they've asked all the existing buildings to review their energy performance and carbon performance against the standards that they've set. And if the buildings don't meet their standards, they have to pay a carbon tax. And it is a huge number. It's about $268 per ton of carbon, which is a massive number. If you look at the tall size skyscrapers in New York, that'll come up to a big amount at the end of the year. And they have to continue to pay that every year until they improve their performance and the standards go higher. Another example I can give you for carrot is the Inflation Reduction Act that came out in the US earlier this year, where about $369 billion would be invested into clean energy and infrastructure. What that means to the built environment is that there would be an infrastructure in place when we're talking about the transition to green and clean energy inside our buildings, inside the cities and developments and so on. And what this also means is that there would be credits given to energy efficient homes that are going to be built in the US. So this is the type of carrot that I was talking about, which would, of course, link to the supply, wherein, as we see it today in the built environment, the supply of energy efficient buildings exists, but it's slow and it's very, in my opinion, not enough to make the change that we need to see. So I would like to close by saying, let's supply to create demand now, sooner rather than later, because we haven't got enough time to do it and our targets are set. So let's act on it now. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Nidhi. I have so many follow-up questions for you, but I wouldn't want to influence the vote, so we'll leave those for afterwards. I think before we go to Smith, we're going to play a video about the C40 Clean Construction Accelerator, also intended to increase demand. So I'm hoping that we can see that right now. Is that how it can happen? It's on its way.
most of the future construction and building work will happen in cities. How we build our cities is decisive for world's climate. It is only by working together that we can scale up. Together, we send a powerful signal of change, providing the market with the confidence they need to invest in necessary transition, rethinking their businesses and creating green and just jobs.
La Ciudad de México se congratula de ser signataria de la iniciativa Clean Construction del C40. La Ciudad de México ha tomado varias líneas de trabajo para impulsar este trabajo de construcción limpia. Por un lado, ha ajustado su marco normativo para permitir, para impulsar el reciclaje de los residuos de la construcción.
Ekurhuleni knows the challenges that lay ahead of a steep rise in its urban population. More housing and infrastructure call for more social and environmental justice, as well as for more green employment. The construction sector in Ekurhuleni accounts for 7% of the city's total employment. Business as usual in construction will not help. On top of releasing tons of emissions, it means worsening air quality and undermining resilience to climate risks like floods and heat. By transitioning to clean construction, our city can shift the national and regional market to innovative construction materials and create local green jobs.
I am Giuseppe Sala, I am the mayor of Milan, Italy. Clean construction is climate action. In Milan we have over 10 billion euros of committed real estate investment right now. They must be a key driver of the green and just recovery we are striving for. Cleaner construction materials and processes, green good jobs for citizens, a new level of innovation in urban regeneration. Clean construction is key in our decarbonization strategy. We, cities, are in this together and call for the support of government, the private sector, the unions, civil society. Clean construction can help us build more sustainable, greener and fairer cities now.
Excellent, and thank you to C40 Cities for the accelerator, and thank you to the cities that have joined the accelerator and the other initiatives to helping to pull that public demand lever. And with that, I'd like to ask Smith to address us on behalf of the public demand side lever about what you're seeing in terms of the signals of change necessary for the transformation of the built environment by 2030.
Thanks very much. I hope you can all hear me. I also thank you for having me, and I apologise about all the blowing my nose that I'm going to have to do over the course of all of the air conditioning has gotten the better of me. So the video actually did a really wonderful introduction there of the Clean Construction Accelerator Programme that I'd like to talk to you about. So Björn Happold have been working with C40 Cities on this programme over the last couple of years. And the Clean Construction Accelerator, it's a statement of political leadership. It's about reducing our embodied emissions in terms of both new buildings and infrastructure by 50% by 2030 from 2020 benchmarks, and also introducing zero emissions construction machinery. And that's by all municipal projects by 2025 and citywide by 2030. And that really helps to not only address the embodied carbon, but also the air pollution and the kind of working conditions and some of the other points that those mayors were bringing up there. So we have a number of cities that have signed up so far, including Budapest, Los Angeles, Mexico City, Oslo, and San Francisco, as well as now London and Milan. And then there's also the Clean Construction Action Coalition, also listed in the video there, that includes a number of different parties that are there to sort of support that public action, including Björn Happold and the other companies listed there. So The piece of work that we've done over the last couple of years is doing deep dive studies into 6 cities, Toronto, Milan, Mexico City, Ekurhuleni, Quezon City, and Qingdao. And really trying to understand what are the ways in which the cities can mobilize their city powers in order to bring about this transition. And so I suppose my pitch, please vote for public demand, is that there's a huge amount that the public sector, whether that be national or subnational governments, such as cities, can do. And I want to thank my competitor here for already bringing up some of these excellent points. Because, of course, there are carrots and sticks, and there are things to do with sort of building codes and planning, permitting. There are incentives to do with sort of, whether that's incentives to do with sort of reducing the amount of time that it perhaps takes to get permission, or tax incentives and so on. But the other key things that I think are really, really important are infrastructure and procurement. So in terms of infrastructure, things like having waste sorting facilities that support implementing of a circular economy, such as being able to reuse materials. I think things like training and data sharing platforms also create infrastructure to enable these kinds of changes. And the public sector can help provide these things that actually enable the change for all sectors, all aspects in all sectors as well. And then the other thing is procurement and flagship projects. Flagship projects can all obviously sort of not only sort of create a kind of proof of concept, a kind of evidence that these projects are possible to achieve. But procurement is really, really, really key, and I think that's the main thing that I kind of want to end on. I just want to give a couple of quick examples. In Milan, for example, there's a piece around tracking vacant and derelict spaces and ensuring that there's a program that's going to bring all of those spaces back into use within 18 months of those being identified. In New York, there's the Clean Construction Executive Order, where municipal procurement is actually requiring low-carbon concrete and cement and low-carbon construction machinery through those municipal processes, and they're already having a big impact. In Oslo, you can get points now for using zero-emissions machinery in municipal procurement, and already that's having an impact. And the estimated figures are that within 2022, about 15% of sales of new construction machinery is now electric, and through that procurement process. And then finally, I just want to give a shout out to Exeter City Council, because, and I know we've probably all heard this example before, but Exeter City Council decided back in 2009 to build all of their new council houses to Passive House standards. And back in 2009, that meant that they incurred a 20% cost premium. But because of that demand signal that sent, over the last sort of now 13 years, that cost premium is reduced down to 4% because of the upskilling in the industry and the clear signal that sent. So that just really proves that if we, through our public sector demand signals, we can make a difference, make it more affordable and more feasible. So, yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Smith, for making the case for the public demand lever. I'll pass next to Balsam on behalf of the private sector.
Thank you, Victoria. So we've heard a lot of talk as to the importance of every single stakeholder being part of the engagement to get to... Okay, I'll go again. So we've heard a lot of talk as to the importance of every single stakeholder being part of the driving the mission to get to our targets by 2030 and then by 2050. And all of them are really important. Not one sector could do it alone. But what's for sure is that it's the private sector that would help put forward the expertise, because it's the sector that actually has the expertise in hand. So when we've seen those videos and when we've heard the different talks, we do realize that it's up to the designers to kind of steer the direction towards advocating, raising awareness, and informing our clients and all of the stakeholders that are involved as to the importance of integrating sustainability, integrating low-carbon solutions within their designs. It's also the role of the different contractors to really provide the solutions, the working available solutions that are out there to influence the construction sector, which we've seen through the video from that was played just previously, the importance of the construction sector playing a major role in this. It's also part of the procurement to really work on the market maturity to kind of provide the right solutions for a lower carbon emission. And it's also the importance of really creating the right balance between what operational carbon solutions are versus what embodied solutions are. And that's where the role of the private sector comes into play. Another important aspect that was picked up on is the importance of really balancing between the infrastructure and the buildings, so working horizontally and vertically across the built environment, and how the private sector can really pick up on the right solutions that are out there rather than working in silos to make sure that we have that integrated approach to get us to our targets down the path. Another important thing is that the private sector is able to really tackle all applications that do cause, let's say, the different carbon emissions, from the urban environment to the transport sector to the resources sector. We know that the solutions are all available with the different parties that are involved from the private sector. Is just the way to implement them, the way to sit together and make sure that those solutions are put on the table for implementation. And then lastly is the importance of the private sector play on the existing and the new build, and the importance of tackling it from a holistic approach rather than a focused approach. And that's my pitch for today.
Excellent, thank you, Balsam. Okay, let's move on to Hastings representing policymakers.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I think let me just start by saying that we cannot really achieve the 2030 breakthrough without a radical reform of our policies and our regulations. I think that would be my point of departure. The reason C40 is busy with policymakers is basically to lay the foundation and provide that conducive environment for actions that can enable us to achieve the 2030 breakthrough. So the starting point for us is to mobilize the policymakers themselves. So the C40 Net Zero Carbon Building Accelerator, the C40 Clean Construction Accelerator is actually purposed to actually achieve that. The mayors that you have seen in the video are mayors that have signed up to those accelerators and therefore are encouraged to ensure that they create a policy and regulatory environment in their cities. We are seeing those policies, those regulations are paying off in C40 cities. Of course, developing them is one part of the story, but also we are ensuring that the policies are implemented, the policies and the regulations are enforced. So we are seeing this paying off. Maybe a couple of examples. I think one that comes to mind is when you look at Tokyo. Tokyo was the first city in the world to place mandatory emission targets on buildings back in 2010. Since then, the 1,200 buildings affected by these targets have installed over 11,000 emission saving measures, reducing overall building emissions by 33%, equivalent to almost 1.4 million tons of carbon. Now, to me, when you have these statistics, you actually see already how just a change, a shift in policies or in regulation can actually be impactful. In South Africa, the four South African cities, Johannesburg, Cape Town, Durban, and Pretoria, Tshwane, they actually come together to actually review their regulations towards really achieving net zero buildings. Now they're transitioning to actually enforcing that and implementing that. We are already seeing some results coming out of that. So this just emphasizes my point radical policy reform, ambitious policymakers, mobilizing them, and of course ensuring that they take actions. I'll conclude by just also citing some of what I see as opportunity areas when it comes to policymakers and policy reform to actually achieve the 2030 breakthrough. I think the first point my colleague has mentioned, we need circularity in the building and construction sectors. We need a new business model. Currently, around 95% of the value of construction materials is lost as our existing buildings decay into obsolescence and then demolition. The world's building stock will be doubled by 2060, and as new construction creates an estimated third of the world's waste, the sector cannot afford to not tackle waste and consumption. So we need to really get some radical policy reforms around circularity. We need to engage the business sector, to have new forms of collaboration with the business sector and industry to drive circular practices and construction, which demonstrate a kind of like a new business practice, business model that is compliant to 2030 breakthrough. The second area is basically around market shifting policies. When you look at our cities and regions, they are large owners of public buildings, large owners of infrastructure stock, be it social houses, be schools, municipal houses, hospitals. That to me is a starting point for really ensuring that they lead from the front and be able to shift the market by actually ensuring that they encourage demand for net zero buildings. So there is a huge opportunity for policymakers to create that demand signal for low carbon, circular and resilient construction and systems, and by utilizing their own utilities and assets. And of course, finally, and I'll stop there, is about financing. So we basically need to ensure that there is also reform in global financing, as well as private sector financing, to ensure the resources are directed to net zero buildings. Thank you so much.
Excellent. Thank you, Hastings. Let's go to Lucy on behalf of Finance. Oh, sorry, yes.
Thank you. Thanks, Hastings. I thought you were about to launch into my finance pitch there. Thanks very much, Victoria. So, yeah, let's talk finance. As we'll all know, buildings is a hugely capital-intensive space, and money talks. Finance is an absolutely essential cog if we're going to decarbonise the built environment. And green buildings represent a massive investment opportunity. I think Nigel, in his opening pitch, talked about a $27 trillion investment opportunity by 2030. It's 800 billion in Africa alone. And that's the continent where we'll see the building floor area double by 2050, and 90% of that will be in residential. The likes of the Cities Climate Finance Leadership Alliance show that the level of investment in green building is increasing, but it is woefully inadequate at present. So what are the changes that we need in order to kickstart that flow of finance into green building solutions? Well, obviously, there's lots of different elements. I'm going to touch quickly on two. Firstly, the ability to access, absorb, and effectively use the financing available is absolutely critical. Otherwise, it doesn't matter whether there's $5 million on the table or $500 billion on the table. If it can't be absorbed and effectively used, then it doesn't really make a difference. So what we need is well-structured, scalable projects which are meeting the needs of low-income groups. And I say that because the vast majority of building, as we know, in the next period of time is going to be in emerging markets. And in emerging markets, 70+% of the population are living on informal or low incomes. So we need to be targeting our green build solutions to that income bracket. And in this, blended finance is absolutely critical. And by that, I mean the provision of capital alongside concessional support to construction developers for project preparation and for project pipeline development. And also technical assistance, so financing technical assistance for innovation. That essentially is Real's business model. So Real is an innovator and an investor in green affordable housing in cities across Africa and Asia. But we're calling on development finance institutions to adopt much more of this approach, to be bolder, to be willing to take greater risk upfront, to get behind innovative financial mechanisms, demonstrate market viability, and really unlock markets that crowds in private finance. That should be, and it must be, their role. The second element that we're already beginning to see change in, which is to sort of kickstart that transformation to green building, is the setting of green criteria for investment. Now, in emerging markets, the IFC's EDGE tool, so that's Excellence in Design for Greater Efficiencies, EDGE, is the market leader. That's allowing certification of minimum green standards for new buildings, and that provides the needed assurance and understanding that essentially that kite mark for investors to get involved to understand what they're investing in and the green credentials. I just really quickly want to draw on a tangible example that hopefully speaks to those two elements, and as today is Solutions Day at COP, it's really super important that we focus on solutions. So with the Global Innovation Lab for Climate Finance, we've developed Green Affordable Housing Finance. This is an instrument to catalyse climate-smart affordable housing in emerging markets. And bearing in mind that we need 300 million new homes by 2030, this is absolutely critical if we're going to achieve climate success. So Green Affordable Housing Finance firstly deploys concessional finance and technical assistance to green housing developers to kickstart the flow of EDGE certified green homes. In parallel, it provides advisory support and financial guarantees to local finance institutions to de-risk them and to incentivise their lending to green affordable housing developers and the associated offtake for those homes. So by that I mean mortgages and rent-to-buy schemes tied to those green homes. And that element is absolutely critical. The lack of housing finance for low and informally employed clients, which is 70% of the population in Africa, is the major blocker. Without an exit for their investment, private finance is not going to be attracted into the sector. So we've got to tackle that. And just to give a quick illustration of how important that is, in the whole of Kenya, there are just 26,000 mortgages. That's it. And they're all, as you can imagine, they're for high-end homes. So Green Affordable Housing Finance is an ecosystem-wide instrument tackling both the supply of those green homes and the demand, allowing low-income people to buy those homes. And importantly, it's normalising green building in the process. So the instrument, excuse me, the instrument is rolling out in Kenya and is projected to mobilise over $400 million in private finance in the next 15 years. But with greater backing from the likes of development finance institutions, that can be scaled and it can be replicated across multiple countries. So just to finish, with affordable housing demand already at 60 million units and growing, the time for these innovative financial solutions is absolutely now. It's paramount. Thank you.
Super. Thank you very much, Lucy. And finally to Alejandra from the Institute of Human Rights and Business.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. It's a pleasure. I'll start by, really thanking you for having civil society at the table, especially represented by a human rights organization. I think this is really meaningful at a time when we have activists and NGOs being repressed, persecuted, and imprisoned even only for speaking up. So I really mean it when I say it is truly a privilege to be here, as it is for all of us. So thank you for that. When we speak of civil society, I think it's very challenging for me, because this is a very diverse group with its own interests, its own demands. It also depends a lot on the context, on who really civil society is. So for the purpose of this session, I want to bring the voices of the workers, of the construction industry, but also down the supply chain, the importance of tenants, as Nidhi pointed out at the beginning, of local communities, indigenous peoples, coastal communities, all those directly and indirectly impacted by the processes of the built environment. So this is simply a human rights lens approach that I'm bringing here to the discussion. And I want to make 2 points here for the session. The first one is the leverage that civil society has to scale solutions. We have a key role of behavioral change whenever that is possible, and when that is done massively, it has a tremendous impact. So one example that I can think of is the citizen energy communities in Europe, when by the installation of solar panels on the roofs of people, when this is done at the district level and massively, citizens are able to become part of the solutions and stop being the demanders of energy or the consumers only, but they were able to produce more energy than they consume and start trading it and selling it. So that's very meaningful in terms of energy production, but also in changing the power relations of who the people are and the role that they have in society. But we have to also be conscious that the scale of that impact depends a lot on how conducive the environment is to allow for those solutions. So now we refer to the Global South, for example. I can give you one case from Bangladesh, from the initiative POCA. It's the Platform for Community Action and Architecture. And this is a context in there is no participation at all, and decisions in the built environment are done very top-down. But a group of concerned architects really posed the questions on what can they do to be part of the solution and to involve the community. So they approach different people, different community sectors, and ask them what are the changes that they want to see in the built environment, and they enable them by bringing the technical expertise and the needs from the population to actually be able to make proposals and present them to the city council and be taken into account. So this is a really interesting example that we have when civil society, given the opportunity to participate and given the tools, it can have very meaningful solutions. And the second point that I wanted to make is that civil society is actually the enabler for the other levers that we have here. And if we think about it, civil society is really all of us. After we leave our 9-to-5 jobs, we are the citizens that vote for governments, that vote on elections, and that hold governments accountable in democracies. So also accounting for context there. But we're also the consumers of the built environment. We buy and rent houses, we consume energy, we pay our energy bills. We buy the products and services that actually allow businesses to exist. We are also the workers that sustain the supply, the whole value chain. We are the local communities who have realized the power of unions, of collective action, and that speaks of a signal change as well. So to conclude, my call is just to remember the transformative power that civil society has, that we all have here when we are coordinated, empowered, and allowed. Thank you.
Thank you, Alejandra. Thank you for bringing such an important perspective to this conversation. I think with this, we'd like to open the voting. So no pressure, but you've heard from all of our interventions about the lever that they feel will create the largest impact. We ask you now to vote. Which of these levers do you think will create the largest impact? As you've heard from all of our speakers, I'd just like to make some reflections as you're doing that. You'll find the QR codes printed around the room, and hopefully we'll see it on screen in a moment as well. You'll have the opportunity to vote for which of the levers of change you feel have the largest impact in driving towards our 2030 goals for the built environment. For me, we've heard from all of our speakers so far that we really need to be taking these short-term actions in order to simply transform, although it's not a simple task, the way that we spend our money in our buildings, the way we use our buildings, and the way that we engage with them on a daily basis. And I don't know if you noticed, but all of you mentioned other levers as part of your interventions, which I think just shows how interconnected they are. Of course, we can't rely on one of these levers or one of these stakeholder types alone to get us out of this situation, but we're asking you to consider which you feel would have the largest impact, and creating the enabling environment that will help us accelerate the solutions we already have to unlock new solutions in terms of new business models, new finance opportunities in order to help us drive that market transformation. There it is. Okay, so here's the QR code on screen if you don't have it in one of the printed formats around the room. I'm not sure I'm allowed to vote, actually, or any of us. We'll leave it to the audience, and hopefully those at home, you voted. Okay, it might be a little skewed. But please do take a moment to, again, consider which you feel is the most significant in creating the largest impact. I'm going to recap them for you now as they're written within the Built Environment 2030 Breakthrough. The first is supply, how different actors across the built environment can shift the sector, and the lever action that we've identified for the sort of very short-term waypoints to show us whether we're on track for that 2030 goal is that energy efficiency measures reduce operational intensity of new buildings by at least 30% by 2025. The second lever of change is the demand signals from the public sector. So as we've heard, cities, subnational and national governments, as not only policymakers but major owners of enormous assets of public building stock and public procurement mechanisms that they can use to demonstrate leadership and send us that demand signal to market. The lever action here for 2025 is that 100% of public procurement policies in place prioritize the retrofit or mandating that new developments are net zero carbon across the whole life cycle. The third one is demand signals from the private sector in order to prevent and mitigate embodied emissions, increase resource efficiency, and stimulate the development and market supply of low carbon products. The private sector can generate a strong and urgent demand signal to activate the market to decarbonize our built environment. And the lever action here is that signatories to the World Green Building Council's net zero carbon buildings commitment exceed 10% of large businesses by 2025, and I'm thrilled that we've got signatories on this panel today. The policy lever is that visible, tangible action at a local level creates real change, and that mandatory measurement and reporting of whole life carbon is required by subnational and city planning policy by 2025. Equally in regulation in a sector where standards for new development are stipulated by technical code compliance, mandatory regulation by national governments is equally critical as a lever in transforming the built environments. And we heard earlier from Nigel about the buildings breakthrough, which is bringing those national regulation actors along as well on this journey. Finance, the opportunity to drive sustainable investment. And the lever action here is that whole life carbon costs is internalized in all private investment decision makings for buildings and infrastructure by 2025. And finally, civil society. Individuals and organizations can mobilize change by championing and demanding a transition away from the use of fossil fuels within their homes. And the lever action here is to access to a renewable electricity covers 40% of global housing by 2025. Okay, how are we doing? Has everyone had a chance to vote for your favorite pitch? All right, I'm seeing some nodding. Can we please bring up the results? If that's possible. While we're waiting for the results, I see we've got Christina still here in the room. Hi, Christina. Christina Gamboa, CEO of World Green Building Council. I was just wondering, Christina, about this. I wrote down when Nidhi mentioned change management, because you often say that we're in the business of change management, right? And we've heard a lot across the course of this week and around the sort of macroeconomic challenges that the world is facing, why energy efficiency is becoming so significant in the conversation of energy security. Perhaps you could just share your reflections about how that agenda is sort of proliferating through the conversations at COP while we're waiting for the results to come through.
Thank you very much. I think the results are in, so I'll be super quick on that one. Well, thank you so much. It's excellent to join you all and hear great pitches. I hope you're all winners. I think we need every lever, but we'll hear out the results in a second. Energy security. This week I've been possibly, from what I've heard, reflecting that it's possibly, and hearing civil society, that the built environment is possibly just wasteful and not mindful. The energy problem is we haven't designed out waste from buildings, and the use and the energy consumed is not mindful of the availability of resources. And as we are living through an energy crisis in some regions of the world that is a fossil fuel energy crisis, that is because we have a built environment that still uses energy in a wasteful way, it's creating a lot of havoc because we haven't retrofitted buildings in a mindful way, in the passive design ways you were also flagging. So I think it's really interesting. It's responsibility of all the actors here on the table of figuring it out. And of course, we're here to support. That's why we're here. But it's being mindful of designing out waste, and the energy crisis is really a matter of helping people reduce their energy demand, because the cheapest fuel is the one we don't use. And sometimes we forget that, and we need to reduce energy demand. There's not going to be enough energy in the world to power up the sector. We need to do more with less.
Oh, thank you so much, Christina. And I feel like that philosophy applies to all of the levers, all of the actors across the value chain, no matter what the results of our survey here today. So thank you so much for sharing that. Okay, so we have the results in. So in terms of the most critical lever action that the people in the room here, and hopefully those of you at home as well, that are getting us closest, or has the potential for the largest impact to get us closest to the 2030 breakthrough outcome. Out in front is policy and regulation. Well done, Hastings. Second is finance, and then thirdly, but actually very closely, both the demand side levers. First, just ahead is the private sector with that investment and procurement opportunity with their own stock and their own facilities and infrastructure, but also the private sector is a demand. So I think we can call that a tie. But it just goes to show the really significant power that the demand side actors have as part of this conversation. No offense to the other actors. We're still gonna bring you into the conversation, but I'd like to just come back to each of you in a moment and see how you feel that for the lever that you represent, how your lever can help drive change from the other levers or the other actors that have come out on top. So those three: regulation, finance, and the public sector demand signal. How does your lever enable change or enable greater uptake from those levers that we've identified has the largest potential? Just before, I'll leave you for a moment to think about that. And just before I come to you, I just wondered if there was anyone in the audience that wanted to share what you voted on and why, if it's something that you... Hi, James. Sure.
I'm always noisy. Sorry, Victoria. Finance, I'm interested just which of us in the room represent the finance and investment community, just as a quick hands-up survey. Great. Okay, I think that tells us a lot. 320 plus trillion real estate, and most of that is residential, is the largest global asset class. Finance has been a huge debate at COP, and we are completely missing from it in most of the rooms. And I think if it is true, and I'm a great believer, the Laudes Foundation is funding a lot of work on how finance and investment flows really shape what we're able to do. And I'm a great believer we need to be in that room if we believe it's such a strong lever, and ensure that many more of our colleagues from that community are in our room. So there's a lot of innovation there. I think there are fantastic groups, IIGCC, Climate Bonds Initiative, Green Finance Institute, many of these groups who have increasing building smarts and who are willing to work with us. So that's my small plea to the room, to make sure that we're really, really doubling down on that second most important lever.
Excellent. Thank you very much, James. If Hugh's watching from home, get well soon from IIGCC. And if you want to add to the conversation, please do send your thoughts in. But absolutely, James, thank you. Would anyone else like to reflect on the results? Yes, hi.
Hi, Judy Zakreski with the
Hi, Judy.
International Code Council. Policy and regulation, I think, is top for us. But I do like what Balsam said about enforcement. And I almost wish that was a separate category, because a policy is no good unless there's an enforcement infrastructure in place. There's a lot of countries, a lot of jurisdictions around the world adopt building codes, but a lot of them sit on a shelf, and then they're not achieving what they're meant to achieve.
Yeah, that's so right. Thank you so much. Thanks, Julie. Hi, Kurt. Welcome.
Hi, thank you. I have also voted for policy and regulations, and I think the reason that I have done it is that we, until today, we have only had legislation that is in the use phase of buildings.
Yeah.
We are focusing on energy efficiency, and that's very good, and it is extremely good, but it is focusing on the in-use phase, in operational phase. And if we want to decarbonize the building stock, we need to focus on the whole life cycle of buildings. And we don't have regulations on that. And we are far behind. So I really think that policy and regulation is one of the most important things. I also support finance, because finance will drive a market. But I would like to see much more legislation in this field.
Sure. Thank you so much, Kurt. Okay, I think we should have another chance to bring in some audience perspectives, but I think we've given our panelists here long enough to think about what their responses will be based on these answers. So again, keen to know, so let's start with Nidhi from the sort of supply side of things. How does the supply chain action support these other levers advancing? Oh, yeah, your mic.
Thank you. Definitely the supply of energy efficient zero carbon buildings is affected by the policies and regulations that are in place. But with the current state at the moment, if you look across the globe, there are lots of cities and jurisdictions where these regulations and policies are not laid out. And if we were to wait to deliver, for them to come into action and then deliver something, I think we'll miss the boat. We are already very late. So in my opinion, when we're looking at supply, yes, it's a good driver, policies can drive, but we have to act today, and we need to start thinking about how can we go above and beyond the policies as well. So a good example, I mean, I work for JLR, and as a policy, or as a target, we've set to get to net zero by 2040. And with that, what it means that whatever offices we have to make sure our emissions are the lowest. Recently, we fitted out one of our offices, and we tried to make sure that everything that we use in terms of materials have very low embodied carbon. We managed to reduce approximately about between 30 to 40% of embodied carbon, which is the target that policies are setting for 2025 or 2030. We've shown it that we can do it today. And I think as actors, as we are there to set an example for the entire world to follow. And yes, policies can drive it, but if we wait for them, it could be a bit too late. So in my opinion, we should start to act now as soon as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. Super. Thank you, Nidhi. Please, Smith.
Thanks. So, I mean, I think the interactions between public demand and policy and regulation are probably quite clear, but I think there are sort of two things that I want to say. One is that policy and regulation do need to really take a very clear leadership position and try to sort of not just wait in this kind of game of chicken for the private sector, for the industry as a whole to kind of catch up, because then we end up with these sort of the very, very soft targets that mean that actually we're not getting anywhere near to where we need to be. And I think that public demand is key to enabling this, because if you have policy and regulation that has kind of clear stepped targets, and that the public procured projects and finance, which is, it's huge. In the UK, it's 25% of all construction. It's an enormous driver. Then if those projects can take the sort of the leadership position that then kind of more projects kind of take on over time, then you can create a very clear route map, a clear trajectory that allows the supply chain, the private demand side to understand what's coming next. And so I think that's really important. And I think the other thing about policy and regulation is that it can cross different sectors. It can bring learnings. It can bring like those interactions together that might not otherwise happen. And I think that's so, like, we all talked about each other's levers. And I think policy and regulation can do a huge amount to connect these different things. You sort of asked us to look at numbers sort of 2 and 3 a little bit as well. I think I was kind of hoping that finance would win, because I was kind of hoping that we'd all be able to kind of talk about how finance should be, is able to support all of the different levers that we have, because I think it's really important that it is that way round and not the other way round. Like, we are not here in service to finance, in service to the markets. Like, the point of finance, of money, of our markets, of our economy, is to help like move the stuff and the resources and the things to the people and the communities that need the stuff and the resources of the things. And that should be the role of finance and the role of money. So I'm going to say it anyway, because I think that's important. But I mean, obviously, as James has said, there are innovations happening in that space. I think we need to do a great deal more to kind of think about how we can have new economic models in order to achieve these things. And that can also happen through policy and regulation. So, yeah, thanks.
Indeed. Thank you very much. Balsam.
So as I've mentioned at the beginning of my talk, it's not just one player, it's everybody together. And you do see this from the results of the poll, that it really needs everybody to be working together to make this happen, the 2030 breakthrough that we're here discussing today. Now, representing the private sector, I think our influence and what we need to be looking at is more engagement and more commitments. So in terms of the engagement, I think first at the policy and the regulation side of things, it's how the private sector can help influence the policies and direct the policies depending on the different demands, the different markets, the different sectors, and the different cultures. Second, how you can also inform via the expertise of the private sector and the exposure that the private sector has, the finance, because when we speak about net zero, we speak about cost, which was brought up at the beginning. So how would cost make sense? Because that's what the financial sector really looks at, return on investment. So what are the low-hanging fruits? What are the easy, workable, affordable solutions that are out there? And that's how the private sector can influence as well. And then for the rest, the public sector, the civil society, the supply, all of this is very important. And the private sector can play a big role in this. I would just like to highlight on the point of the civil society that it's consumers that also drive the demand. And there's a big role there. And then I would just like to close by saying that we need more commitments. Victoria, you've mentioned the 10% of large companies that have committed to the World Green Building Council net zero commitment. And I think that it's very important. We need further commitments. We need people to walk the talk and to use their lessons learned into influencing everyone else, and to be advocates of a whole life carbon approach that we've been discussing today. Thank you.
So, Hastings, policy came out on top. Are you surprised?
The interactions, I think, are obvious, or those are important. But at least, let me just call out civil society. And I'm glad that they're included in this conversation. We need, I think she has said it there, we need to have people demand better policies. And for us to mobilize the people, to mobilize the push for change, we need active civil society. And of course, also, once those policies are developed, she was talking about enforcement of regulation, implementation of that policy. We need to also have an active civil society that actually pushes for the implementation. I have said that C40 mayors are leading. They are having ambitious policies and regulations, but sometimes the implementation requires other players. In C40, we have C40 mayors and youth forum. And what happens is that for some policies, the youth work alongside the mayors to actually push for implementation of the policies by the mayor, by other actors like business sector and so on. So I think there is a huge interaction between policy development and regulation development, implementation, enforcement, and civil society and the general public.
Thank you, Hastings. Please, sorry, Lucy, pass the mic. Thanks, there we go.
Yeah, thank you. I'm not surprised that policy and regulation comes up front. It's super important, but I echo everyone on the panel here saying that they're all important. In fact, actually, we can't have this breakthrough. We can't have this breakthrough without all of these levers and all parties around the table. It requires collaborative action for us to unlock green buildings. I guess speaking particularly from a finance perspective for the towards policy and regulation. So increasing the availability of green finance, I think, gives policymakers the confidence to set ambitious targets and regulation. I mean, particularly thinking about emerging markets, the danger is that setting these higher levels of standards and regulations will potentially could be seen to inhibit investment. So with green finance comes that confidence to be able to set those high standards and not worry about not being able to provide the investment into their cities that they need. So that's one thing. And so thinking about it from the other way round, policy is really key for a conducive operating environment that will open up the market and allow finance to flow. If I can just give a couple of examples. In Ghana, the government have implemented a reduction in building permission costs for green buildings. In Kenya, there's tax breaks for green developers. They're mandating EDGE across all their new green buildings, of homes, that is. And they've got a really super ambitious target of 200,000 units per year, EDGE certified. So that combination of finance and policy is super important. Also on the policy front, I talked about clearly if we're just focusing on green buildings, actually, you know, there's a challenge there. We need to be thinking about the wider planning of cities and where those green buildings are situated. So planning, regulation, zoning, access to land, etc. is super important. And if I may just quickly, a third point as well. In all of this, data and evidence is really critical. So the quality of data and the accessibility of data to inform decision-making, both of investors and of government. And if you think about it, all those levers are key for that data and evidence agenda. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Lucy. And finally to Alejandra.
Thank you. Yeah, I think policy regulation is absolutely key. From my point of view, here we can see the relationship between policy regulation and civil society in two ways. The first one is how does policy regulation can benefit from the power of civil society. And I think here it's important to highlight how much we can harness the local knowledge of communities through participation strategies, through community engagement, to really participate, give an input, or even co-create these policies that at the end would make everything so much easier, actually, just ensuring community support, the uptake, and facilitating the implementation of those same decarbonization policies if people truly understand the need and the benefits of why we're doing this, why we have those policies. And then, of course, that creates the opportunity to leverage and scale these solutions, not only from some groups, but in the entire cities. So that's one way of the relationship that I see it. And the other way is how can the leverage of policy regulation can actually create social benefits and protect human rights of civil society, of the groups that I mentioned, of how we can protect workers, tenants, and local communities. So I think it's absolutely critical to have good policy regulations, these frameworks that interact very closely with civil society, as Haisling was mentioning. I totally agree with your points that it's these two sectors and the communication and the open and honest dialogue that we have between these two that would enable change. So just to conclude my point, we speak so much of the climate transition, but we really have no transition without a just transition that is inclusive, participatory, that is fair, that is based on human rights, and that accounts for and harness the power of civil society. Thanks.
Move here. Thank you very much. Okay, I'm now down here. First of all, just thank you so much for all of those interventions. I think it's really powerful that you've all drawn on the power of the various stakeholders and actors across the value chain to drive change. So thank you so much for those initial reflections, and I'm sure you're going to continue pondering the results of those of our survey over the coming weeks and months, and you know the level of collaboration that you've already shown, and hopefully that others can use that spirit to continue into their work long after we leave Sharm el-Sheikh here in Egypt. We've got a few minutes, oh, now I've lost my clock. Okay, so we've got a few minutes until we close today's session. Just curious if anyone has any burning questions they'd like to ask to any of our panelists. No? Does anybody have, thank you, does anybody have a different perspective that we haven't heard yet from the panel that you'd like to share? Or did we cover all bases? Please.
Hello, I'm
Hello.
Jill Ferguson, representing the California Public Utilities Commission, which is a regulatory body, but also I'm a PhD student at Stanford. Listening to this, I'm thinking about civil society wanting to get these kinds of retrofits or new homes, but when I think of them having to finance things, I think it shouldn't be on them, like that onus, right? And so I'm thinking about coming from a perspective of utility industry finance, so both private and public utilities procuring retrofits or even new buildings as a demand-side resource and using their CapEx for that. Of course, that can only get you so far because the utilities will want to pass that along in the rates. But the utilities are fundamentally disinterested in doing retrofits or any kind of building demand-side procurement unless their regulatory regime incentivizes it. And then, of course, the policymakers do not want to put a regulatory regime in place that would incentivize more efficient retrofits or new buildings unless civil society has been asking for it. And of course, civil society cannot have the capacity or funding to influence policy unless they are paid to have that seat at the table. And so I'm sort of wondering, with that sort of a spiral of a chicken and the egg, what you've seen as maybe a quick and efficient sort of relay race almost, where they pass the baton between these different players to do this in a way where everyone can live in healthy, efficient, no fossil, homes that they personally don't have to finance, right? Because we won't get there if we do it in a each person has to pay for it and interest, right? So just curious about thoughts.
Yeah, and again, to Christina's point, not as simple as waiting for an energy transition either, right? There's so many mechanisms and additional levers we have to pull in order to make that a reality. Would anyone like to respond? I mean, you might have to come here, but does anyone have a response or thoughts to share? Oh, please. Oh, sorry, I've got your mic.
Thank you. Yeah, maybe I can add to your point that, yeah, coming to the importance of policy, and we had this discussion in another session yesterday on one hand, the role that they have to provide those incentives for energy efficiency, but at the same time they have the power to create those social protections to ensure that the cost does not get passed to the tenants. So the example that I gave you yesterday on rent caps, for example, is very important to ensure that we're doing both things at the same time. Like decarbonizing, have the right policies, having energy efficiency, and seeing how we move the environmental side of things forward, but at the same time ensuring we do that inclusively and as fair as possible. Yeah, I'll leave it at that. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you so much. Yeah, huge challenge, and I think one that we're just scratching the surface of. So thank you so much for sharing. Okay, so I think with that, I just want to say a huge thank you to everyone who's been here to represent the levers, everyone from the Champions team that has driven this agenda forward for the 2030 Breakthrough Agenda. I'd like to call on anyone in the room who represents any of these actors or levers, or even better, anyone who doesn't, to really visit. There's a website specifically for this breakthrough that breaks out the levers. It shows the signals of change and encourages you to take action. We can all take action to mobilize not only the finance, but all of those levers that we saw within the poll and that have been discussed here today, because simply without addressing all of the levers that came from second onwards, we cannot expect the policy and regulation to follow. So we need to be proving the possible, we need to see that change management, we need to be completely shifting what we're terming as business as usual, and we need to be shifting the way we value carbon and the way that carbon is used within our buildings. And if it can be done today, then we need to be doing it today. We cannot wait for regulation, which I think was a point that Smith made. Thank you very much for making that statement. And I think ultimately, following commitments from the private sector, from the public sector, mobilizing these solutions cannot be done without mobilizing people. So thank you very much, Alejandra, for bringing that to our attention today as well. So with that, I think we can close this session. Thank you very much for being here. A huge thanks to the Climate Champions and to everyone who's participated in this session. There's still more events to go about the built environment, so please check out the events calendar on buildingtocop.org if you don't have your afternoon planned out already, and hopefully we'll see you again for the same conversations next year with even more examples of implementation and action from our sector. So thank you very much, everyone.